Some places keep a record of what happened there, etched into the air itself. The stories you're about to hear are pulled from that static, from the moments when the rational world failed and something else answered the call. You're about to hear stories that blur the line between memory and nightmare. Enter the world of true horror stories and subscribe, but only if you're really not afraid, seriously. Title: The Signal on Coal Ridge. Dale Jarrett believed in the orderly transmission of information, in the elegant physics of radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere to connect strangers across continents. His retirement shack, nestled in the quiet folds of the West Virginia mountains, was a sanctuary of controlled chaos, wires and vacuum tubes glowing with a warm, predictable light against the deep Appalachian dark. For 30 years, he had been a fixture on the amateur bands, his call sign a familiar, friendly voice cutting through the static of lonely nights. He knew the rhythms of the airwaves, the way solar flares could open up talk with Australia, the way a passing storm could fill his receiver with the sound of frying bacon. But what he heard on a moonless Tuesday in July of 1999 was different. It was an aberration, a signal that did not belong. It began precisely at 2:07 in the morning, a time when the bands were usually silent save for the faint hiss of the cosmos. It was not Morse code, nor was it a voice. It was a simple, pure tone, a carrier wave keyed in a steady, repeating pulse like an automated distress call, a mechanical heartbeat in the void. Dale meticulously logged it, noting the frequency, the signal strength, the disturbing clarity. An emergency locator transmitter, he first reasoned, perhaps from a downed aircraft deep in the Monongahela National Forest. Yet the signal was too clean, too stable. It lacked the waver and fade of a signal traveling through miles of dense foliage and unforgiving terrain. It sounded like it was broadcasting from next door. For the next 3 nights, the phenomenon repeated itself with unnerving precision. At 2:07 a.m., the tone would begin its lonely broadcast, and at 2:24 a.m., it would cease as if a switch had been thrown. Dale began the methodical work of triangulation, using his directional antenna to pinpoint the source. He felt a familiar thrill of the chase, the intellectual puzzle of it all. He dismissed the creeping unease in his gut as a symptom of too much coffee and too little sleep. The results, however, did not point to a remote crash site in a deep valley. They pointed squarely at the scarred peak of Coal Ridge, a place locals had avoided for a generation, home to the long-defunct Blackwood Strip mine. This was impossible. The Blackwood mine had been shut down in the late 70s, its equipment auctioned off for scrap, its power lines cut and salvaged decades ago. Dale knew this for a fact. He had watched the crews pull down the towers himself. What could possibly be broadcasting from a dead mountain? He cross-referenced old geological surveys and mining maps, his rational mind desperately seeking a logical answer. Maybe it was an undocumented seismic sensor, powered by a geothermal vent. Or perhaps it was an unusual radio reflection, a trick of the atmosphere bouncing a signal from hundreds of miles away and focusing it on his location. But the math did not support that. The signal was too strong, too localized. After a week of sleepless nights and the constant maddening tone haunting his headphones, Dale made a call to a friend, a man named Rick, who worked for the state's Department of Environmental Protection. He explained the situation, feeling foolish as he did, a grown man chasing radio ghosts. Rick was skeptical but intrigued by the technical challenge. He promised to look into it. The official records confirmed everything Dale already knew. The Blackwood site was listed as dormant, fully decommissioned, with no active power or infrastructure remaining. The property had reverted to the state, a forgotten wound on the landscape. But Dale's persistent logs, detailing the signal's unwavering regularity, were compelling. Rick agreed to authorize a site inspection, citing a concern about potential environmental contamination from old mining equipment, a plausible excuse to get a team on the mountain. On the day of the inspection, Dale sat glued to his radio, his receiver tuned to the team's communication frequency. He heard their trucks struggling up the overgrown access road, the men complaining about the mud and the thickets of rhododendron that clawed at the paint. He listened as they described the main mine entrance, a collapsed and flooded pit of stagnant orange water. Everything was as expected. Then, one of the inspectors, a younger man named Kevin, called out. He had found something. It was a small cinderblock maintenance shack set back from the main pit, half swallowed by the forest. The door was secured with a heavy, rusted padlock. Rick gave the order to cut it. Dale held his breath, the static in his ears seeming to grow louder. There was a pause, the screech of bolt cutters, and then Kevin's voice came back over the radio, strained and confused. The lights were on. Inside the small, dusty room, a single bare bulb cast a sickly yellow glow over a small array of antiquated radio equipment. A simple repeater station bolted to a metal table. A thick layer of undisturbed dust covered everything. Everything except the equipment itself, which looked strangely clean. The team's handheld Gauss meter screamed, detecting a powerful electromagnetic field. The repeater's vacuum tubes were glowing warmly, and a low, steady hum filled the shack. Rick asked the obvious question over the radio, the same one screaming in Dale's mind. Where was the power coming from? The inspectors followed the thick, insulated cable from the back of the repeater. It didn't lead to an external generator or a hidden power line. It snaked across the floor and went straight into the solid concrete foundation of the shack, disappearing into the earth itself. There was no conduit, no junction box. It was simply gone. The team leader confirmed with the power company dispatch, a call Dale listened to with a growing sense of dread. There were no active electrical grids within a 10-mile radius of Coal Ridge. There hadn't been for over 20 years. The equipment in that shack was operating on an impossible power source. Rick ordered them to disconnect the unit, but there was no switch, no circuit breaker. It was hardwired directly to the cable that plunged into the ground. As the team debated what to do, Dale watched his clock. It was 2:06 a.m. He switched his receiver back to the mystery frequency, his heart pounding against his ribs. The inspectors were still talking when it happened. The hum in the shack intensified, a deep thrumming that vibrated through the radio. And then, at 2:07 exactly, the tone began, blasting through Dale's headphones with pristine clarity. It was coming from the repeater. In the shack, the inspectors recoiled from the sudden noise. They described how the dust on the floor around the table began to vibrate, forming strange, intricate geometric patterns, like sand on a speaker cone. The air grew cold, a deep, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the mountain night. They reported the smell of ozone and damp earth. After 17 minutes of the relentless broadcast, the machine fell silent. The team, thoroughly unnerved, retreated from the shack, sealing the door behind them and filing a report filled with phrases like anomalous energy source and further investigation required. No further investigation ever took place. The report was buried in a mountain of bureaucracy. Dale's friend Rick called him one last time, his voice low and serious. advising him to forget what he'd heard and to turn his antenna in a different direction. Dale tried. He really did. But he could never again find comfort in the familiar static between stations. He had spent his life listening to the voices of the world, believing he understood the medium. But he now knew that something else was on the airwaves, broadcasting from a dead mountain, powered by the silent earth. It was a signal with no known sender, a message with no known recipient, a steady, patient pulse in the deep and listening dark. He sold his equipment the following year, unable to bear the silence of his shack, a silence that felt heavier, more watchful than before. The official explanation for the event, a buried note in the state files, suggests a rare form of telluric current interacting with the mineral-rich rock of the old mine, a 1 in a million geological phenomenon. But Dale knew better. A geological event doesn't keep a schedule. It doesn't broadcast a distress call. And it doesn't wait for someone to be listening. The real question, the one that kept Dale awake in the years that followed, was never about the signal itself. It was about who or what it was meant for, and what would happen if it ever got a reply. The ARRL ham log from July of 1999 still exists, stored in a box in his attic, its final pages filled with the neat, frantic script of a man who had accidentally tuned into a conversation far older and stranger than his own. Title: The Hollow Schoolhouse. Sarah Jenkins believed in the quiet order of a well-run classroom, in the smell of chalk dust and floor wax, in the comforting rustle of textbook pages turning in unison. As a substitute teacher bouncing between the underfunded schools of rural Kentucky, she had seen it all. Broken equipment, unruly students, and the weary resignation of overworked staff. But she was good at her job. She could command a room with a quiet word, her calm competence a welcome balm in the daily chaos of public education. The assignment at North Fork Elementary, a small, isolated schoolhouse tucked into a wooded hollow, was supposed to be an easy one. She was covering a third-grade class for a teacher on maternity leave. The building was old, a relic of stone and timber from a time when one room held all the children from the surrounding farms. It was March of 2005, a damp, gray month that made the woods press in close, their bare branches like skeletal fingers against the classroom windows. The first day was perfectly normal. She introduced herself, followed the lesson plan, and managed a minor dispute over a blue crayon. It was on the second morning, during the ritual of taking attendance, that the first thread of normalcy began to unravel. She called out the names from the official county ledger, a thick, leather-bound book with decades of entries. 22 students were enrolled. 22 students were present. But as she prepared to close the book, her eyes caught something at the bottom of the page. Below the last printed name, 2 more had been added in a child's neat, careful cursive. Elias Thorne and Mercy Clay. Sarah frowned. She hadn't called those names. She scanned the classroom, counting the small heads bent over their morning work. 22. Exactly. There were no unfamiliar faces, no children she couldn't account for. She assumed it was a clerical error, perhaps students who had transferred out without the roster being updated. She drew a neat line through the 2 names and made a mental note to ask the school secretary about it. But when she checked the desks, she found them. 2 small, empty desks in the back corner of the room, slightly separated from the others. She hadn't noticed them the day before, lost in the general clutter of a well-used classroom. They seemed different, older, the wood darker and scarred with the faint outlines of carved initials. On a whim, she opened the lid of the first desk, the one that would have belonged to Elias Thorne. The interior was not empty. It held a small nod pencil, a handful of smooth river stones, and a single crumpled piece of paper. Sarah unfolded it. It was a drawing, a child's simple sketch of a tall, thin figure with long arms, standing amongst the trees outside the classroom window. There was no face, just a dark, empty space where it should be. A shiver, cold and unwelcome, traced a path down her spine. She checked the second desk, Mercy Clay's. Inside, she found a small, tarnished silver locket, empty, and a spelling test with a perfect score. The name Mercy written at the top in the same neat cursive as the ledger. The date on the test was from 1958. This was no longer a simple clerical error. This was something else. She took the ledger and the items to the school principal, a gruff, weary man named Mr. Abernathy. He glanced at the names, his face clouding over. He told her to ignore them. He said the old building had its quirks, that records from the consolidated schools were a mess. He claimed the desks were just old furniture they hadn't gotten around to junking. His explanation was plausible, sensible, yet his eyes wouldn't meet hers. He seemed more eager to dismiss the issue than to solve it. Sarah tried to put it out of her mind, but the two empty desks now held a strange gravity. She would find herself watching them, expecting to see a hand raised, a head pop up. The other children seemed oblivious to them, their games and chatter flowing around the empty space as if it wasn't there. The next day, the names were back in the ledger, written again in that same precise hand below her own strike-through mark. This time, she felt a real spike of fear. She was the last person to handle the book. It was locked in her desk drawer overnight. No one could have touched it. She began to notice other things. The faint smell of wood smoke in the back corner of the room, even though the school used a modern furnace. The sound of a soft whisper that would die the moment she turned her head. Pencil shavings would appear on the floor beneath Elias's desk, and the faint scent of lavender, like old soap, would linger around Mercy's. The other children remained unaffected, lost in their own world. But Sarah felt a growing, oppressive sense of being watched. The woods outside the windows no longer seemed beautiful. They seemed to be waiting. The silence of the hollow was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with unspoken history. Desperate for a rational explanation, Sarah requested access to the school's new CCTV system, installed just a few months prior. She wanted to see who was getting into her classroom at night. She spent her lunch break spooling through the grainy black and white footage of the previous night. The camera showed the empty classroom, bathed in the pale glow of the security lights. The hours ticked by. Nothing. No one entered. No one left. The door remained shut, the windows secure. But as she watched, she noticed something happen to the two empty desks. Over the course of several hours, a fine layer of dust on their surfaces seemed to shift and thin, as if someone were sitting there, the friction of their clothes slowly polishing the wood. The crumpled drawing she had removed from Elias's desk reappeared, lying flat on the surface, before vanishing again between frames. She felt her breath catch in her throat. She was a practical woman, a person who believed in what she could see and touch. But the evidence on the screen, combined with the impossible reappearance of the names in the ledger, pointed to a conclusion her mind refused to accept. The final straw came on Friday. A cold rain was falling, slicking the windows and making the classroom feel like a lonely outpost against the encroaching wilderness. As the children were packing up for the day, one of the little girls, a quiet child named Lily, approached Sarah's desk. She was holding the small, tarnished locket. "Mercy said you have this," Lily whispered, holding it out. "She wants it back. She says she gets lonely without it." Sarah stared at the girl, her blood turning to ice. She had locked the locket in her desk after showing it to the principal. How could Lily have it? "Who is Mercy, Lily?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lily pointed a small finger toward the empty desk in the corner. "She sits there. She's sad because Elias won't play. He's always watching the man in the trees." The little girl's eyes drifted to the window, to the dark, rain-lashed woods. Sarah followed her gaze. For a split second, amongst the dripping branches and swirling mist, she thought she saw it. A tall, thin figure, unnaturally still, its form blending with the gray bark of the trees. A dark, featureless void where its face should be. She blinked, and it was gone. That was enough. Sarah packed her belongings, left the lesson plans for the next week on the desk, and walked out of the North Fork Elementary Schoolhouse without a word to anyone. She never returned. She broke her contract with the school district and never took another substitute job in that part of the state. The official account, buried in the county school district's files, is that Sarah Jenkins suffered a nervous breakdown due to stress. The attendance ledger from March of 2005 is listed as damaged and replaced. But the stories in that hollow persist. They say that if you look into that third-grade classroom on a quiet afternoon, you can sometimes see the faint impressions left in the dust on 2 old desks in the back. They are the marks of children who never left, taught by a teacher who was never seen, forever learning the lessons of a history that the living have tried their best to forget. The school is still open, a testament to the stubbornness of mountain communities. But they have trouble keeping substitute teachers. They never stay for long. Title: The Mine Elevator Shaft. Markham was a man who understood the language of decay. As a safety compliance officer for a mining reclamation company in Virginia, his job was to walk through the ghosts of once thriving coal operations and assess their slow, inevitable collapse. He documented rusted machinery, measured methane levels in sealed-off tunnels, and mapped the geological instabilities that threatened the surface above. His work was methodical, predictable, and deeply solitary. He preferred it that way. The old Cumberland No. 9 mine was a particularly grim assignment. It had been a beast in its day, a deep shaft mine that had claimed its share of men before being shuttered for good in the early 80s after a catastrophic collapse on its lowest level. Now, in September of 2012, it was a ruin. The head frame stood like a rusted skeleton against the sky, its cables long since cut. The entrance to the main elevator shaft, a gaping concrete maw, was covered by a thick steel plate, bolted and welded shut. Markham's task was to inspect the integrity of that seal and the surrounding infrastructure. The mine was dead. It was supposed to be silent. That's why the notification from the long dormant sensor array was so jarring. An automated alert pinged to his ruggedized laptop from a system that should have had no power, no life left in it. The alert was from the elevator's proximity sensor at the shaft collar. It had triggered. Markham's first thought was a system malfunction, a ghost in the machine born of corroded wires and moisture intrusion. It happened all the time in these old places. He drove out to the site, the gravel road crunching under the tires of his truck. The air was heavy and still, smelling of damp earth and coal dust. The steel plate over the shaft was exactly as it should be, its massive bolts untouched, the welds unbroken. Nothing could have gotten in or out. He accessed the sensor's diagnostic panel, a relic of 1970s technology, housed in a rusted metal box. The logs were supposed to be blank, a flat line of inactivity stretching back 30 years. But there was a new entry, timestamped just that morning. Sensor activation. Cage movement detected. Cage movement. The elevator cage, a 10-ton steel box, had been removed for scrap in 1985. Markham knew this from the decommissioning manifests. The shaft was empty. It was a 900-foot-deep hole in the ground. He reset the system, attributing the reading to a power surge from a distant lightning strike, even though the sky was clear. He filed his report, logged the anomaly as an electrical fault, and tried to put it out of his mind. But a week later, another alert came through, and another the day after that. Always in the pre-dawn hours, when the world was darkest and still, the system was logging elevator trips. Markham felt a professional obligation, tinged with a cold, growing curiosity to investigate further. He got approval for a manned inspection, a 2-man engineering team to rappel down the shaft and visually confirm its status. The day they arrived was overcast and oppressive. The crew, 2 grizzled ex-miners named Calloway and Reese, were unconcerned, treating it as a routine job. They unbolted the heavy steel plate, the shriek of metal on metal echoing across the silent landscape. When the opening was revealed, a blast of cold, stagnant air rose from the depths, carrying with it the smell of wet rock and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling, like old blood. Markham watched as they set up their ropes and harnesses, their headlamps cutting sharp, white circles into the absolute black of the shaft. Calloway went first, his voice crackling over the radio as he descended. He reported nothing but smooth concrete walls, weeping with groundwater, and the steady, unnerving drip of water from above. He reached the bottom, 900 feet down in the heart of the mountain, and confirmed what the manifests said. There was no elevator cage. The shaft bottom was a sump, filled with a few feet of debris and foul-smelling water. It was an empty, dead space. But as Reese prepared to follow him down, Markham's eyes were drawn back to the control shack, a small brick building a few yards from the shaft. Inside, covered in dust and cobwebs, was the original elevator control panel and its mechanical logbook, a device that recorded every trip the cage ever made by stamping the date, time, and destination level onto a roll of paper. He had glanced at it on his first visit, but now he felt compelled to look closer. The logbook was a mechanical device, powered by the elevator's own movement. It required no external electricity. With the cage gone, it should have been frozen on its last entry from 1982. Wiping away a thick layer of grime, Markham unlatched the cover. The paper roll was brittle and yellowed with age, but the ink was still legible. He saw the frantic series of trips logged on the day of the collapse, and then silence. A 30-year gap, until last week. Fresh, dark ink stood out against the faded entries. Multiple trips had been logged. They all had the same destination, a floor that sent a jolt of ice through Markham's veins. Level 6. There was no level 6. Not anymore. Level 6 was the deepest section of the mine, the place where the collapse had happened. It had been completely buried under thousands of tons of rock. The shaft entrance to that level had been sealed with 3 feet of solid concrete. Official MSHA reports from the time detailed the seal, a permanent tomb for the 13 men who were lost and never recovered. The logbook was showing recent, repeated trips to a place that no longer existed. Down in the shaft, Calloway's voice crackled over the radio again, this time with a new edge to it. He was asking about the shaft walls. He said the smooth concrete ended about 100 feet above the bottom. Below that, the walls were scarred, gouged with deep vertical scratches. Scratches that were fresh. The bare rock behind the concrete liner was exposed, glinting wetly in the beam of his headlamp. It looked, he said, like something enormous had been clawing its way up and down the shaft, something that scraped and tore at the very bones of the mountain. Markham relayed the information from the logbook. Trips to level 6. Silence on the other end of the radio. Then Reese, who had been listening from the surface, spoke in a low, trembling voice. He said the old miners used to have a saying about Cumberland Number 9. They said the company didn't just dig for coal. They said they were digging for something else, something they were paid to find, and that the collapse wasn't an accident. It was a containment. Suddenly, a deep, grinding sound echoed up from the shaft, a sound of immense weight and pressure, of stone grating on stone. It wasn't the sound of a rock fall. It was slow, deliberate, mechanical. Calloway yelled over the radio, his voice tight with panic. The seal, the concrete seal for level 6. From his vantage point deep in the shaft, he could see it. Or rather, he could see the opening where it was supposed to be. A dark, perfectly square hole in the shaft wall. It was open. He said he could feel a draft coming from it, a foul, cold wind that smelled of the deep earth. And he could hear something, faintly, from the darkness of the open level, a sound like metal dragging on rock. The grinding noise from below intensified. The entire structure around the shaft head began to vibrate. Markham and Reese scrambled back as dust and pebbles rained down from the head frame. Calloway was screaming into the radio to pull him up now. They hauled on the rope, their muscles straining, pulling the terrified engineer from the blackness. He emerged into the daylight, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that would never leave him. He swore he saw something in that dark opening as he was being pulled past it. Not a person, a shape, something large and angular, like a piece of machinery moving in the absolute blackness, where nothing had moved for 30 years. They sealed the shaft that day, pouring a dozen truckloads of concrete into the opening until it was filled to the brim. The official report, signed by a shaken Markham, cited unforeseen geological instability and recommended the site be declared permanently unsafe and off-limits. The MSHA safety inspection from September 2012 notes the sensor malfunctions and the structural risk, but makes no mention of the impossible logbook entries or the open tomb of level 6. The company paid a hefty bonus for the inspector's silence. Markham resigned a month later. He couldn't shake the image of those fresh entries in the logbook. The precise, mechanical stamps charting impossible journeys. The mine elevator was gone, but something was still making the trip. It was going down to a place of death and memory, a sealed tomb that had somehow opened. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that sometimes it was also coming up. Title: The Blue Highway Turnout. For a long-haul trucker like Kevin Grady, the world was a ribbon of asphalt that unwound under the rumble of his 18-wheeler. His life was measured in mile markers, logbook entries, and the lonely glow of dashboard lights in the dead of night. He was a professional, a man who knew his rig, his route, and the strange, hypnotic rhythm of the road. Interstate 81 through the mountains of Tennessee was a familiar stretch, a winding path through dark hills and sleeping towns. The trip in November of 2018 was routine, a load of consumer electronics heading north. The weather was clear, the traffic light, yet his logbook from that night shows an anomaly, a 17-minute gap that defies explanation. It began around 3 a.m., in a particularly remote and desolate section of the highway. Kevin felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of fatigue, a profound and unnatural drowsiness that seemed to well up from the floorboards of his cab. His eyelids felt like lead weights. He knew the signs of road fatigue and prided himself on his safety record. He made the decision to pull over at the next available turnout, a small, unlit patch of pavement carved out of the mountainside, marked only by a faded blue sign. He remembers the crunch of his tires on the gravel shoulder, the hiss of the air brakes, and the sudden, profound silence as he killed the engine. He intended to rest his eyes for just a few minutes, a quick cat nap to clear his head. He blinked, and the world was different. The first thing he noticed was the light. A pale, pre-dawn gray was filtering into the cab. He glanced at the clock. It was 5:12 a.m. He had been parked for over 2 hours, not a few minutes. A spike of panic shot through him. He was behind schedule. Cursing himself, he started the engine. The familiar diesel roar, a comforting sound in the unsettling quiet. He pulled back onto the highway, his mind racing, trying to account for the lost time. He must have been more tired than he thought, fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep. It was a simple, rational explanation. But as he drove, a sense of deep unease began to settle over him. He felt strange, disconnected, as if he were watching a movie of his own life. The cab felt cold, despite the heater blasting. There was a faint, persistent smell, like static electricity or ozone. When he stopped for fuel a few hours later, he decided to review his dashcam footage, hoping it would jog his memory of the stop. The camera, a new model required by his company, recorded video, audio, and GPS data continuously. He spooled back the footage to the moment he pulled into the turnout. The video was clear. It showed him pulling off the highway, the headlights sweeping across the empty patch of asphalt. He cut the engine, and the view became the static image of the dark, tree-lined road ahead. The audio recorded the click of the ignition and the subsequent silence. The GPS data confirmed his location and the time of the stop. Then things got strange. At the exact moment he had logged the stop, the footage continued, but it showed something impossible. It showed the truck pulling back onto the highway and continuing its journey north. The road was empty, the landscape dark and unchanging. The GPS track, however, told a different story. While the camera showed the truck driving, the GPS coordinates remained fixed, showing the vehicle stationary in the turnout. For 17 minutes, the two data streams were in direct contradiction. The video showed motion. The GPS showed stillness. Kevin stared at the screen, his coffee forgotten. It had to be a glitch, a system error. He had seen tech fail in stranger ways. He kept watching. For 17 minutes, the camera recorded this silent, phantom journey. There was no sound. Not even the usual hum of the engine or the rumble of the tires that the sensitive microphone always picked up. It was a completely dead track. Then, at the end of the 17-minute segment, the footage jumped. It cut abruptly from the moving nightscape to the exact same static view of the turnout he had seen at the beginning of the stop. But now, the faint light of dawn was visible over the ridge. The timestamp jumped forward by nearly 2 hours. The audio kicked back in with a sharp crackle, and he could hear the sound of his own breathing, ragged and fast, as if he had just been running. A moment later, The footage showed him starting the engine and pulling away, the beginning of his actual, remembered departure. The dashcam had recorded a 17-minute drive that never happened, inside a 2-hour stop that he couldn't remember. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. What had happened during that block of missing time? The drive north was a blur of anxiety. Every flicker of headlights in his rearview mirror made him jump. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he had been interfered with. He replayed the silent, moving footage over and over, searching for any clue, any detail he might have missed. There was nothing. Just the endless, empty road, unspooling in perfect silence. The incident came to a head at a mandatory DOT inspection stop just outside of Roanoke, Virginia. The trooper who reviewed his logs was sharp-eyed and thorough. He noted the discrepancy between the handwritten entry for the stop and the electronic log, which, like the dashcam, had registered a period of unexplainable data. The trooper was suspicious, assuming Kevin was trying to falsify his hours of service. Kevin, not knowing what else to do, showed him the dashcam footage. The trooper, a man who had seen every trick in the book, watched the silent, contradictory video with a deepening frown. He took the memory card and disappeared into his office. When he returned, his demeanor had changed. He was no longer accusatory. He was unsettled. He handed Kevin a citation for a minor logbook violation, a slap on the wrist, and told him to get his system checked. "We see weird things out here at night," the trooper said, his voice low, not looking Kevin in the eye. "Signal ghosts from the mountain radio towers, GPS bounces, but I've never seen anything like this." The official roadside inspection report from that day mentions a data synchronization error with the onboard recording device. It's a clean, technical explanation that papers over a terrifying gap in reality. Kevin drove for another 3 years, but the joy was gone. The open road no longer felt like freedom. It felt like a vast, empty space where the laws of physics could be suspended without warning. He would avoid that stretch of I-81, even if it meant adding hours to his trip. He was haunted by the 17 minutes of silent motion, by the 2 hours of lost consciousness. He had been a passive observer to his own life, a passenger in a truck that was both moving and standing still. The dashcam footage, logged as evidence of a system malfunction, sits in a digital archive. It shows nothing but a dark road. But Kevin knows what it really is. It's a recording of a place where the highway briefly passed through somewhere else. A fold in the map where time and distance become meaningless. He left the industry and now works in a warehouse, grounded, surrounded by solid walls and the predictable logic of inventory management. But sometimes on a quiet night, he can still feel the phantom rumble of the engine and sees the white lines of a road that leads nowhere, unspooling in perfect, terrifying silence. Title: The Mill Siren. The Old Roanoke River. Paper mill was a creature of iron and steam, a sprawling complex that had been breathing life and choking dust into the North Carolina air for the better part of a century. For Jacob Vance, a third-generation millwright, its groans and hisses were as familiar as his own heartbeat. In June of 2001, he was part of a skeleton crew tasked with keeping the aging machinery running, a constant battle against rust and decay. The mill had its traditions, its ghosts of habit. One of these was the old shift siren, a massive compressed air whistle on the roof of the pulp house. It hadn't been used in years, replaced by a modern electronic bell system. The power line to its compressor had been physically cut, the valve seized solid with rust. It was a dead thing, a monument to a louder, busier past. so when it screamed to life in the middle of a hot, humid afternoon, the sound was not just loud, it was impossible. The siren's deep, guttural blast ripped through the air, a sound so powerful it rattled the windows in their frames. Every man in the mill froze, the shock of the noise compounded by the sheer wrongness of it. It was a sound that belonged to their grandfather's generation, a call to work that no one had heard for 30 years. Jacob and his supervisor, a man named Henderson, ran for the main control room, assuming some bizarre electrical short had backfed power into the old system. The shift was on their afternoon break, most of the crew outside in the yard, enjoying the brief respite from the clatter and heat. The control room was empty. The new electronic bells were silent. The panel that had once controlled the old siren was dark, its wires hanging loose and disconnected. Henderson got on the radio, his voice sharp with adrenaline, demanding to know who was responsible. The answer was silence. No one was near the pulp house roof. No one could have accessed the controls. The siren wailed for a full minute, its cry echoing off the surrounding pine forests, before sputtering into an exhausted silence. An unnerving quiet descended upon the mill, broken only by the nervous chatter of the returning workers. That's when the second impossibility was discovered. As the crew returned to their stations, they found things were not as they had left them. Heavy, steel safety doors, which were required to be closed and locked during operation, were wedged wide open, held in place by chunks of scrap metal. Conveyor belts, which should have been inert, were moving slowly, their long rubber tongues carrying nothing but dust and shadows through the cavernous buildings. At the main chipping machine, a monstrous device that could chew a whole log into splinters in seconds. The massive flywheel was spinning at a low, steady speed, yet the operator who had shut it down was standing right there with Jacob, his face pale with disbelief. Panic began to ripple through the crew. Henderson ordered a full system shutdown and an immediate evacuation. Something was terribly wrong. As the men gathered in the parking lot, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion, Jacob and Henderson did a sweep of the entire facility, looking for an intruder, a saboteur, any rational explanation for the chaos. They found nothing. No tripped breakers, no signs of forced entry. The strangest discovery was in the main power substation. Jacob was a meticulous record keeper. He knew the mill's electrical draw down to the kilowatt. The logs from the power company, recorded electronically and updated every second, showed no surge of activity corresponding to the siren or the mysteriously activated machinery. In fact, during the exact minute the siren was blasting, the logs showed a slight, inexplicable dip in power consumption. The mill had come to a horrifying partial life without using any electricity. It was as if the machines were running on some other source of energy, some residual memory of motion held within the steel itself. The OSHA report filed the next day is a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. It cites unexplained activation of legacy warning systems and multiple safety protocol failures. It blames an aging infrastructure and recommends a full rewiring of the plant. The report's conclusion, based on the lack of electrical evidence, is that the entire event was a cascade of mechanical failures, perhaps triggered by a pressure fluctuation in a forgotten air pipe. It's a tidy explanation that accounts for none of the specifics, especially the wedged open doors and the moving conveyors. The men who were there that day know the truth was something different. They speak of the feeling in the air after the siren fell silent, a heavy, expectant atmosphere, as if the mill itself had taken a deep breath and was waiting. They remember the unnatural silence of the moving belts, running without the familiar whine of their electric motors. The company brought in a new safety inspector, the equipment was recertified, and work resumed a week later. But the mill was never the same. A deep-seated unease settled over the place. Men would startle at shadows, whisper that the machines were watching them. Tools would go missing from a locked box only to reappear on a high, inaccessible catwalk. The sound of faint metallic scraping would be heard from decommissioned sections of the plant. Jacob Vance worked there for another 6 months before quitting. He couldn't shake the memory of the control room logs, the impossible power dip. The mill hadn't just started on its own. It had woken up, and in doing so, it had consumed something, drawn energy not from the grid, but from the silence, from the very air around it. He took a job at a modern factory, a place of clean, quiet robotics and logical systems. But sometimes in the dead of night, he swears he can still hear a faint, distant whistle on the wind, a call from a place of rust and memory, a machine that remembers how to move, and is just waiting for the right moment to do it again. The old mill was finally torn down a few years ago, but the stories remain. A warning that some places develop a life of their own, and that the ghosts of industry are not always human. Title: The Appalachian Motel. The Starlight Motel was a lonely island of buzzing neon on a dark stretch of US Route 23, a place where the mountains of Virginia pressed in on all sides. For Daniel, the night clerk, it was a quiet, predictable existence. His world was the small, brightly lit lobby, the rhythmic drip of the coffee maker, and the occasional late-night traveler looking for a clean bed. The nights were long and mostly empty, filled with the murmur of the television and the rustle of paperback pages. The night of September 12th, 1996, started like any other. Our handful of truckers had checked in earlier, their rigs idling quietly in the gravel lot. A family on their way to Florida had taken 2 rooms. By midnight, the constant hum of traffic on the highway had dwindled to a trickle. Daniel was working on a crossword puzzle when the bell over the door chimed, announcing a new arrival. The man who entered was unassuming, of average height and build, wearing a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans. His face was unremarkable, the kind you would forget moments after seeing it. He didn't speak, just pushed a worn driver's license across the counter. Daniel glanced at it. The name was local: Robert Prothero. The address was a hollow just a few miles down the road. Daniel recognized the name. Everyone in the small community knew the Prothero family. He looked up from the ID to the man standing before him, a polite smile on his face. "Prothero," Daniel said. "Any relation to the folks over on—" He stopped mid-sentence. He had just remembered something, a piece of small-town news he'd heard a few weeks back. Robert Prothero was dead. He had been killed in a logging accident a month prior. Daniel's heart gave a hard, painful lurch. He stared at the man, who simply watched him, his expression placid, patient. It had to be a mistake. A different Robert Prothero. A fake ID. People use them all the time. But the photo on the license was a perfect match for the man standing in front of him. Daniel's mind raced, searching for a logical foothold. The man's silence was deeply unnerving. He just stood there, waiting. Shaking, Daniel decided to play along. He was alone. The highway was empty. Arguing seemed unwise. He completed the registration, his hand trembling as he filled out the guest ledger. The man paid in cash, crisp $20 bills that felt strangely cold to the touch. He took the key for room 7 and left without a word. the bell chiming his exit into the humid night. For a long time, Daniel just stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to rationalize it. A relative using a dead man's ID? A morbid prank. But the quiet intensity of the man, the absolute certainty of the likeness, defied easy explanation. He felt a creeping dread, a sense that the ordinary world had tilted on its axis. He checked the CCTV monitor, a small black and white screen that covered the front desk and the door. He rewound the tape to the man's arrival. He watched the door open. He watched himself look up from his crossword puzzle. He watched himself interact with no one. The footage showed an empty space at the counter. Daniel could be seen talking, nodding, even taking money from thin air and handing a key to an invisible guest. The tape ran for 3 minutes, a perfect, uninterrupted recording of him checking in a ghost. And then, for the next 3 minutes, the tape went to static, a blank hiss of white noise, before resuming its normal, clear recording of the empty lobby. Daniel felt a wave of nausea. He was a witness to an event that his own security system said had never happened. Yet the guest ledger in front of him, in his own handwriting, and the cash in the register, told him it had. He thought about calling the sheriff, but what would he say? That a dead man had checked into his motel? That his security camera was arguing with his memory? They would think he was drunk or crazy. He spent the rest of the night locked in the office, watching the door to room 7 through the lobby window. The light never came on. No sound came from the room. It was just a dark, silent rectangle among the others. At dawn, as the first trucks began to rumble past on the highway, the day shift manager arrived. Daniel, looking pale and sleep-deprived, told him the story. The manager, a pragmatic man named George, was skeptical but saw the genuine fear in Daniel's eyes. Together, they went to room 7. The door was locked from the inside with the deadbolt. George used his master key to open it. The room was empty, but it had been used. The bed was neatly made, but the sheets were rumpled, the impression of a body still visible on the mattress. A towel lay damp on the bathroom floor. The small bar of soap was wet in its dish. The key was gone. There was no luggage, no clothes, no sign of who had stayed there. Just the quiet, undeniable evidence of a human presence. The guest ledger from that night, with the name Robert Prothero signed in a shaky hand by Daniel, became a local legend, a story whispered among the staff for years. The official explanation was that Daniel had been scammed by someone using a fraudulent ID, a drifter who had slipped out a back window before dawn. But there was no back window in room 7. And that doesn't explain the security tape, which was reviewed by George and then quietly erased. Daniel quit his job at the Starlight Motel a week later. The long, quiet nights had become a source of terror. Every chime of the bell made his heart seize. He couldn't shake the feeling of the cold cash or the memory of the placid, empty eyes of the man at his counter. He had stood at the border between the living and the dead, a reluctant gatekeeper for a traveler on a journey to a destination he couldn't begin to comprehend. The motel still stands, a little more faded, a little more tired, but the neon still glows against the dark Virginia hills. And they say that sometimes on a quiet September night, the occupancy light for room 7 will flicker on for a few hours, even when the room is empty and the key is hanging on the board, a silent testament to a guest who paid his bill and checked out, but never, ever left. Title: The Ridge Fire Tower. In October of 1984, Sam Calloway was a young, ambitious ranger with the U.S. Forest Service, stationed in the sprawling, rugged wilderness of West Virginia. He was a man of the woods, fluent in the language of topo maps and animal tracks, comfortable with the deep solitude of the mountains. His job was to patrol, to maintain trails, and to keep a watchful eye for the telltale plume of smoke that signaled a forest fire. The old fire towers, relics of a bygone era, were mostly decommissioned, replaced by aerial patrols. They stood on the highest ridges, like lonely sentinels, their windows dark, their doors locked. The Black Ridge Tower was one of these, a skeletal steel structure perched on a windswept peak, accessible only by a grueling 4-mile hike. It had been officially unmanned and sealed for a decade. So when Sam, scanning the ridgelines with his binoculars from a valley lookout miles away, saw a light in it, he felt a jolt of pure confusion. It wasn't the frantic, flickering light of a fire. It was a steady, warm beacon, a single point of yellow light shining from the tower's lantern room, as if someone had lit the old kerosene lamp. He watched it for an hour as dusk settled over the mountains, the light a stubborn, unwavering presence against the deepening twilight. His first thought was trespassers, probably kids looking for a thrill. It was a serious safety violation. The tower was structurally unsound. He radioed his superior, who confirmed the tower was supposed to be empty and secure. He ordered Sam to hike up at first light and deal with whoever was there. The hike the next morning was unnerving. The woods were unnaturally quiet, the usual chatter of birds and squirrels conspicuously absent. A cold, damp fog clung to the trees, muffling sound and reducing visibility. Sam felt a strange reluctance, a feeling of being an intruder in his own territory. As he neared the summit, the steel legs of the tower materialized out of the mist, rising up into the gray emptiness. There were no voices, no smell of a campfire. He circled the base of the tower, his boots sinking into the damp earth. He was looking for footprints, for any sign of a recent visitor. He found nothing. The ground was a carpet of undisturbed leaves and pine needles, softened by the overnight dew. It was as if no one had walked there for months. This was wrong. Someone had to have climbed the tower to light that lamp. He hollered up, his voice sounding small and thin in the oppressive silence. U.S. Forest Service. Anyone up there? No reply. Only the mournful sigh of the wind through the steel girders. He began the long climb up the narrow, rickety stairs, his hand tight on the cold metal railing. With every step, the sense of unease grew. The air became colder, heavier. When he reached the top platform, he found the trapdoor leading into the small cabin locked. Not just locked, but bolted from the inside. He stared at the heavy iron bolt, slid firmly into its hasp. It was impossible. He was looking at a door that had been locked by someone who was now, somehow, not there. He called into the radio, his voice strained. He explained the situation, the impossible lock, the lack of footprints. His superior, a man who didn't believe in anything he couldn't see on a spreadsheet, told him to force the door. Protocol was protocol. With a heavy pry bar from his pack, Sam worked on the trapdoor, the screech of protesting metal echoing across the silent peak. The wood splintered, and with a final groaning crack, the door swung open. He hoisted himself into the cabin. The room was empty. A thick layer of dust covered the floor, the small cot, and the map table. But in the center of the room, the old brass kerosene lamp sat on its gimbaled mount. The glass chimney was still warm to the touch. The wick was blackened and smoking faintly. The small brass fuel tank, when he checked it, was still half full of oil. Someone had been there just moments ago. They had lit the lamp, waited, and then vanished from a room locked from the inside, leaving no trace of their arrival or departure. Sam stood in the center of the small, dusty room, a cold fear creeping into his heart. He looked out the grimy windows, at the endless sea of fog that blotted out the world below. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a feeling of being impossibly high up and terribly alone. He noticed a logbook on the map table, its leather cover cracked with age. He blew a cloud of dust off it and opened it. The entries were from the last fire watcher who had manned the tower, a man named Elias Vance, dated from the fall of 1974. The last week of entries became increasingly erratic. The watcher wrote about the silence, how it was a heavy, listening kind of quiet. He wrote about seeing lights down in the hollows where there ain't no houses. He mentioned a strange, recurring dream of a tall, thin man made of smoke walking between the trees. The final entry, dated October 30th, 1974, was a single, scrawled sentence. "He's coming up the stairs. The fog is his cloak. He doesn't make a sound." After that, the pages were blank. Official records state that Elias Vance abandoned his post and was never seen again. Sam closed the book, his hands trembling. He had forced open a door he should have left sealed. He had stepped into a story that hadn't ended. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes, making the whole tower sway. In the moan of the wind, he thought he heard a voice, a faint, whispering sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. He didn't wait to hear what it said. He scrambled out of the cabin, not even bothering to close the broken trapdoor, and half climbed, half slid down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop running until he was back at his truck, miles away and 1,000 feet below. The USFS Ranger log from that day in October 1984 is brief. It notes that Ranger Calloway investigated a report of trespassers at the Black Ridge Tower, found signs of a forced entry by unknown parties, and secured the location. It makes no mention of a lamp that lit itself, a door locked from the wrong side, or a logbook filled with a dead man's fear. Sam Calloway requested a transfer to a station in the flatlands of eastern Carolina the following spring. He never set foot in the high country of West Virginia again. The Black Ridge Tower still stands, a rusted silhouette against the sky. Hikers who venture up there report a strange, oppressive feeling near the summit, and some claim that on a misty autumn evening, you can still see a single, lonely point of light shining from the top, a beacon in the wilderness, lit by a hand that is no longer there, for a watcher who has long since vanished. Title: The Quarry Pool. The old limestone quarry, known to the locals as Sutton's Deep, was the kind of place that summer memories were made of. By day, it was a splash of impossible turquoise water against the stark white of the quarry walls, filled with the shouts and laughter of teenagers. For Ben Carter, a 19-year-old on his last summer before college, the lifeguard job there was perfect. It was easy money, a great tan, and a front row seat to the season's lazy drama. But in July of 2011, the familiar, sun-drenched pool of his youth began to reveal a darker, colder nature. The strangeness began during a night swim meet, an annual tradition hosted by the County Parks Department. The quarry was transformed, the water a black, reflective mirror, the only light coming from powerful floodlights set up around the perimeter. Ben was on duty, his eyes scanning the churning water, the rhythmic splash of swimmers cutting through the humid night air. That's when he saw it. A faint, pulsing glow deep beneath the surface, near the center of the quarry where the water was over 100 feet deep. It wasn't a reflection from the floodlights. This light was its own source, a soft, bluish-white luminescence that seemed to be moving slowly, deliberately, far below the swimmers. He pointed it out to his supervisor, a man named Gary. Gary saw it too, a flicker of concern crossing his face. They watched as the light traced a slow, lazy arc across the quarry bottom before fading into blackness. They agreed not to cause a panic. The official explanation they gave the next day was a trick of the light, perhaps the headlights of a car on the high road reflecting off a submerged piece of old mining equipment. A perfectly logical theory, but Ben knew what he saw. The light had moved with intent. It had felt alive. A few nights later, Ben and some friends were at the quarry after closing, a forbidden but time-honored tradition. They were sitting on the high ledge, the water a silent, inky void below them. The conversation died down, and in the quiet, they all heard it. A low, humming sound that seemed to be coming from the water itself. It was a deep, resonant thrum, a sound you felt in your chest as much as you heard with your ears. As they listened, the lights appeared again. Not one, but 3 of them, moving in a coordinated pattern deep in the black water. They circled each other, pulsed in unison, and then shot off into the deepest part of the quarry and vanished. The humming stopped. No one spoke. The magic of the summer night was gone, replaced by a primal, chilling fear. The next day, Ben went to the county records office. He was a smart kid, methodical. He wanted answers. He found old geological surveys of the quarry. They showed nothing unusual, just layers of limestone. But then he found the power company's logs for the area. On the nights the lights had been seen, the local grid had recorded massive, unexplained power surges. They were instantaneous spikes, lasting only a fraction of a second, drawing more power than the entire nearby town used in a day. The utility company had logged them as equipment malfunctions caused by lightning or animal interference. But there had been no storms on those nights. The incidents were escalating and the Parks Department could no longer ignore them. They hired a team of commercial divers to inspect the bottom of the quarry, to search for any possible source of the lights. Discarded batteries, illegal wiring, anything. Ben was there the day the divers went in. He watched their bubbles break the surface as they descended into the cold, silent depths. The lead diver's voice, distorted and metallic, came through the radio on the boat. He reported near zero visibility below 50 feet. The bottom was a thick layer of fine, white silt, like powdered sugar. They swept the bottom with high-powered lights and metal detectors. They found nothing. No wires, no lamps, no batteries. Just a few rusted pieces of old cable from the mining days. The quarry was clean, but as the divers were preparing to ascend, one of them reported something else, his voice tight with confusion. He had found tracks. Down in the silt, 100 feet below the surface of a landlocked quarry pool, were fresh tire tracks. They were wide, deep-set grooves, like those from a heavy industrial vehicle. The tracks formed a perfect circle in the center of the quarry floor, then led off into the deepest, darkest section of the pool, a fissure that the old maps called the well, and disappeared. How could there be tire tracks at the bottom of a sealed quarry? The water hadn't been drained in 60 years. No vehicle that large could have gotten in or out without anyone noticing. The news of the tracks spooked everyone. The county, fearing a lawsuit, closed the quarry for the remainder of the season, citing geological instability. The official incident report mentions the unexplained power surges and the divers' inconclusive search, but omits any reference to the impossible tracks in the silt. It was a problem with no solution, a mystery best left buried. A few weeks later, under pressure from concerned locals, the county decided to partially drain the quarry to allow for a full visual inspection of the bottom. Ben went to watch, a sense of grim anticipation in his gut. As the water level slowly dropped, the stark white walls of the quarry were exposed, revealing themselves to be much deeper than anyone had imagined. When the water was low enough, the bottom was finally visible. It was a vast, empty bowl of white silt. The tire tracks were gone. The silt was smooth, undisturbed, as if it had been wiped clean. There was no sign that anything had ever been down there. The quarry was just a quarry again. It reopened the following summer, the story of the lights and the tracks fading into local legend, another ghost story to tell around a campfire. But Ben never swam there again. He had seen the lights. He knew about the power surges. He believed the divers. He understood that Sutton's Deep wasn't just a swimming hole. It was a doorway. Something was using the quarry as a temporary parking spot, a place to stop and recharge before moving on. The County Parks Incident Report from July 2011 sits in a dusty file cabinet, a sanitized version of events. It offers a rational world, a world of equipment malfunctions and tricks of the light. But the real report is in the memory of a handful of people who saw something that summer, a memory of a humming living darkness, a memory of a vehicle that could drive where there were no roads, leaving tracks that could vanish as quickly and mysteriously as they appeared. Title: The Last Train Signal. The railroad tracks that snake through the mountains of West Virginia are veins of steel, arteries of a dying industry. For a veteran CSX conductor like Frank Miller, they were also a map of his life, every curve and grade etched into his memory. He knew the language of the signals, the green for clear, yellow for caution, red for stop. It was a simple, immutable logic that had governed his world for 40 years. In January of 2004, that logic was shattered. Frank was at the helm of a heavy coal drag, lumbering through the frozen landscape near Bluefield. The night was profoundly dark, the air so cold it felt brittle. His route took him alongside the old Tug Fork spur line, a stretch of track that had been officially decommissioned a decade earlier. Its rails were still there, but they were rusted and disconnected from the main line, slowly being swallowed by the wilderness. The signals along that dead line were dark, their lenses like vacant eyes. They had no power, no purpose. They were just monuments to a busier time. As Frank's train rounded a long, sweeping curve, his headlights illuminated the familiar silhouette of the Tug Fork signal bridge up ahead, and one of its lights was on. It was glowing a steady, perfect green. Frank stared, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. A green signal on a dead line? It was impossible. His co-pilot, a younger man named Bobby, saw it too. "What in the hell is that?" Bobby whispered, his voice full of disbelief. Frank's training, 40 years of ingrained instinct, took over. A green signal, regardless of its location, was an indication of a clear track ahead, an instruction that had to be acknowledged. He slowed the massive train, its brakes groaning in the cold air, and radioed dispatch. His voice was calm, professional, but his heart was hammering. "Dispatch, this is CSX 5822. We have a visual on a green signal on the old Tug Fork spur, mile marker 301. Can you advise?" The reply from dispatch was laced with confusion. The dispatcher, a woman Frank had known for years, confirmed what he already knew. The tug fork line was dark. It was listed on her board as having no power, no signal control. She had no explanation. She told him to proceed with caution and that she would log the anomaly. Proceed with caution. The words felt hollow. Caution for what? A ghost on the line? Frank brought the train to a crawl as it passed the signal bridge. The green light was bright, unwavering, casting an eerie glow on the snow-dusted tracks below. It looked for all the world like a fully operational signal, a silent invitation onto a track that led nowhere. Once they were past it, Bobby suggested they stop and check the relay box at the base of the signal to see if some vagrant had somehow hot-wired it. It was against protocol, but Frank agreed. The mystery was too compelling to ignore. They climbed down from the locomotive, their boots crunching on the frozen ballast. The silence of the mountains was absolute, broken only by the low rumble of their idling engine. They crossed the dead tracks and approached the relay box, a heavy steel cabinet designed to house the signal's electronic brain. The box was sealed, not with a modern lock, but with a thick layer of rust that had fused the door to its frame. It hadn't been opened in a very, very long time. Using a heavy wrench from the engine's toolkit, they forced the door open with a screech of protesting metal. Inside, the scene was one of complete decay. The relays were a corroded mess of green and white, the wiring brittle and crumbling to the touch. A bird's nest sat on top of the main transformer. There was no power here, no life. It was a technological corpse. But as they stood there, a faint, rhythmic clicking sound started up from within the corroded machinery. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a relay trying to engage, a mechanical ghost twitching in its sleep. And as they watched, a faint green light began to glow from the filaments of a shattered indicator bulb deep within the mechanism. The signal was trying to power itself, drawing a phantom current from the frozen earth, from the memory of electricity. Shaken, they slammed the rusted door shut and climbed back into the warmth of the cab. They didn't speak for a long time, just the rumble of the engine filling the silence. The green light stayed on, watching them until they rounded the next bend, and it was lost to sight. The CSX rail dispatch log from that night in January 2004 shows a brief entry. CSX 582 reports visual anomaly, tug fork spur, possible electrical interference. Advised to proceed. It's a simple, clean explanation, but Frank Miller knows what he saw. He saw more than just a malfunctioning light. He saw a piece of the railroad that refused to die. The old-timers, the men he'd learned from, used to tell stories about phantom trains, ghost lights that would appear on abandoned tracks, replaying a long-forgotten journey. They were just stories, of course, tales to pass the long hours of the night. Frank had never believed them, not until that night. He retired 2 years later, but he never forgot the impossible green light. It was a signal that defied all logic, a welcome onto a road that no longer existed. He came to believe that the railroad had a memory, that the immense weight and energy of the countless trains that had passed had left an impression on the land, an echo that could still, on a cold, dark night, reach out and turn on a light. He imagines a train, a silent ghost of steam and steel, still running that abandoned line, forever on time, forever cleared for a journey that never ends, its passage marked only by a single, unwavering green light in the deep, listening wilderness. Title: The Mine Rescue Pager. George Tierney's life had been defined by the deep, suffocating darkness of the Pennsylvania anthracite region. For 35 years, he was the captain of a mine rescue team, a man who voluntarily descended into the aftermath of collapses and explosions, into places where the air was poison and the earth itself was trying to crush you. He had seen things in that darkness that he never spoke of, the kind of horrors that cling to a man's soul. He retired in 1993, trading the constant adrenaline for the quiet rhythms of his garden and his workshop. One of the few relics of his old life was his rescue pager, a chunky, brick-like device from the late 1970s. It was a direct-to-squad alert system, long since replaced by modern radios. Its battery was dead, its frequency obsolete. It sat in a dusty box in his garage, a silent memento of a dangerous past. In August of 1997, on a quiet, humid summer evening, the pager went off. The sound was thin and warbled, a high-pitched shriek that cut through the chirping of the crickets. George was in his workshop, cleaning his tools. The sound was so alien, so out of place, that it took him a moment to identify it. He dug through the old box, his heart beginning to beat a little faster, and found the pager. Its small, red LED screen was glowing faintly, the device warm in his hand. It shouldn't have been possible. The battery had been dead for years. As he watched, a message began to scroll across the tiny screen, the letters forming slowly, deliberately. Collapse. Shaft 4. Knox mine. Immediate assistance required. Below the text, a set of coordinates appeared. George felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The Knox mine. The Knox mine had been the site of one of the region's worst disasters back in 1959. The Susquehanna River had broken through the mine ceiling, flooding the tunnels and killing 12 men whose bodies were never recovered. The mine had been sealed, filled with concrete and earth over 40 years ago. Shaft 4 hadn't existed for a generation. It was a memory, a scar on the landscape. He shook the pager, tapping it against his workbench, convinced it was a bizarre malfunction. But the message remained, glowing with a steady, insistent light. The coordinates it displayed were not for the main entrance. They pinpointed a location deep in the woods, a place he hadn't thought about in decades. It was the location of an old forgotten air vent, a secondary shaft that had been sealed at the same time as the main entrance. Acting on an instinct he couldn't explain, a sense of duty that had been dormant for years, George wrote down the coordinates and got in his truck. The drive took him down old, overgrown logging roads, the kind that tear at a vehicle's undercarriage. He found the spot just as dusk was settling, a small, overgrown clearing deep in the forest. In the center of the clearing was a massive concrete cap, thick with moss and weeds, the seal for the old air vent. It was supposed to be solid, impenetrable, but it was cracked. A large, jagged fissure ran across its surface, a crack that looked fresh. A small plume of cold, damp air, smelling of methane and wet coal, was hissing from the opening. He put his ear close to the crack, and he heard it. Faintly from deep within the earth, a sound. It was the rhythmic, metallic tapping of a hammer on a pipe, the universal distress signal of a trapped miner. Someone was alive down there. Someone was trapped in a mine that had been a flooded, sealed tomb for 40 years. George scrambled back to his truck and called the county emergency services on his cell phone. He tried to explain the situation, his voice tight with a mixture of urgency and disbelief. The dispatcher was confused, telling him the Knox mine was inactive, that there was no one down there. He insisted, telling them about the pager, the cracked seal, the tapping. He was a respected figure in the community, a man whose word carried weight. Reluctantly, they agreed to send a team. While he waited, he stood by the cracked seal, the impossible beeping of the pager in his pocket echoing the tapping from below. he felt the old weight of responsibility settle back on his shoulders. He was a rescue captain again, standing at the precipice of a disaster that shouldn't be happening. When the emergency crew arrived, they were skeptical, but their sensitive listening devices confirmed what George had heard. Faint, rhythmic tapping was coming from deep underground. The air quality meters they lowered into the crack registered dangerously high levels of methane, but also, impossibly, a small pocket of breathable air. The situation was surreal. A rescue operation for a ghost crew in a phantom mine. Over the next few hours, a full-scale operation materialized in the small clearing. Heavy equipment was brought in to break apart the concrete seal. News crews arrived. No one could explain what was happening, but the evidence was undeniable. The tapping continued, a steady, desperate heartbeat from below. As they finally broke through the seal, revealing the dark, gaping maw of the shaft, the tapping stopped. A profound silence fell over the clearing. Rescue teams, equipped with breathing apparatus, were lowered into the darkness. They descended into the old tunnels, their lights cutting through a blackness that had not been disturbed for decades. They found the source of the tapping a few hundred yards from the shaft bottom. It was a section of tunnel that had, against all odds, remained a dry, sealed pocket amidst the flooded labyrinth. In the center of the space, a rusted hammer lay on the ground next to a corroded air pipe. There were no bodies, no survivors, just the hammer and a set of 12 neatly stacked mining helmets, each one covered in a thick layer of dust and time. The rescue was called off. The official MSHA Historical Society note on the incident is brief and clinical. It suggests the tapping was a geological phenomenon, seismic activity mimicking a human signal. The pager activation is dismissed as anomalous radio frequency interference. The mine was resealed, more permanently this time. But George Tierney knows what he heard. He believes that for one night, the veil between the past and the present grew thin. He believes the spirits of those 12 lost miners, trapped in a moment of terror from 1959, reached out across time, their desperate call for help, finding the one device and the one man who would know how to listen. The pager never made another sound. Its battery, when tested, was found to be completely corroded and inert, incapable of holding a charge. It sits on his mantelpiece now, a silent testament to a rescue mission that arrived 40 years too late, a call that came from a place where time has no meaning and where the darkness holds onto its ghosts with a grip that never, ever lets go. Title: The Mountain Church Bell. The old Mount Zion Baptist Church was a relic, a simple white chapel slowly surrendering to the relentless grip of the Appalachian wilderness. Deconsecrated in the late 1960s, it stood on a lonely ridge, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. In April of 1982, a young man named Russell was hired by the county for a summer job, a list of odd maintenance tasks at derelict public properties. One of his duties was to check on the old church, make sure it was secure, that vagrants hadn't moved in. It was a quiet, lonely job, and Russell didn't mind the solitude. The strangeness began during the spring thunderstorms. The church had a small bell tower, home to a heavy cast-iron bell. The rope had rotted away years ago. The bell was inaccessible, immobile. Yet, on stormy nights, people in the hollows below swore they could hear it. A single, clear, resonant chime, cutting through the rumble of thunder. They dismissed it as the wind, as a trick of the acoustics in the hills. Sound did strange things in the mountains. Russell heard it himself one evening, a storm rolling in as he was packing up his truck. A single, pure note, tolling once, carried on the wind from the ridge above. It was a beautiful sound, and a deeply unsettling one. The next day, he decided to investigate. He used a tall ladder to access the bell tower's louvered opening. Climbing inside, he found the bell exactly as it should be, hanging silent and heavy in its yoke. There was no rope. The clapper was thick with rust and cobwebs, seemingly fused to the inside of the bell. He pushed on the massive iron lip with all his strength. It didn't budge. It was a dead weight, a silent mass of metal. How could it have rung? He noted the anomaly in his log for the county, a simple entry. Bell tower secure, bell inoperable. He tried to put it out of his mind, another mountain mystery with a logical, if elusive, explanation. Maybe a lightning strike had been close enough to vibrate the tower, but the bell kept ringing. Always a single chime, always during a storm. It became a local legend, the ghost bell of Mount Zion. Russell's unease grew with each report. He felt a strange pull to the old church, a feeling that it was not as empty as it seemed. He started spending more time there, documenting the decay, but also listening, watching. He noticed other oddities. Inside the main chapel, a thick layer of dust covered everything. The floors, the pulpit, the altar. Everything, that is, except the pews. And not all the pews, just specific spots on them. In the third row on the left, a small, person-sized area was completely free of dust. In the fifth row on the right, another. It was as if a silent congregation was still gathering, their presence alone enough to keep the dust from settling. In these clean spots, old, tattered hymnals were often found left open. The pages would be turned to a different hymn each time he visited. Abide with me. Nearer, my God, to thee. Shall we gather at the river? Songs of comfort, of passage, of meeting again. This was not the work of the wind. This was deliberate. Russell stopped trying to find rational explanations. He was no longer a maintenance worker. He was a witness. He felt that the church wasn't haunted in a malevolent way. It felt patient. It felt like it was waiting. One afternoon, he found an old parish ledger in a damp, forgotten closet. He spent hours carefully turning the brittle pages, a record of births, baptisms, and deaths from a century of mountain life. He found a recurring detail in the funeral records. The church had a tradition. When a member of the congregation passed away, the bell would be tolled a single time as their body was brought to the church for the funeral service, a final summons to worship. The bell he was hearing wasn't a random occurrence. It was a signal. It was an announcement. He started cross-referencing the dates of the storms, the nights the bell was heard, with the local obituaries. The correlation was terrifyingly perfect. On the night old Mrs. Gable died, a storm had swept through, and the bell had chimed once. When a young man was killed in a car accident on the mountain pass, the bell had rung again during the ensuing downpour. The church was still performing its duties. It was still calling its congregation home, one soul at a time, its voice only audible when the sky wept with rain and thunder. The final proof came on a hot, still day in late August. There were no clouds in the sky, no hint of a storm. Russell was doing some work on the church's foundation when he heard it. The bell. A single, clear, heartbreaking chime that echoed across the silent, sun-drenched hills. He felt a cold dread wash over him. A bell with no storm. What did it mean? He packed his tools, a sense of finality settling upon him. As he drove away from the church for what he knew would be the last time, he turned on his truck radio. The local news station was just reporting a massive multi-car pileup on the interstate at the bottom of the mountain, caused by a sudden, unexpected fog bank. There were multiple fatalities. The bell hadn't been ringing for one person. It had been ringing for them all. Russell never went back to the church. He finished his summer job and left the county, moving to a city where the sky was obscured by buildings, and the only bells he heard were from ice cream trucks. The county maintenance file from 1982 contains his reports, noting the inoperable bell and the strange clean pews. They are filed away, forgotten curiosities. The old Mount Zion Church eventually collapsed under the weight of winter snow a few years later. The bell, they say, was salvaged and moved to a new church in town, but it never rang with the same pure, resonant tone it had on the lonely ridge. It was as if its voice was tied to that specific place, to the stones and timbers that had absorbed a century of faith and grief. And the new church discovered something strange. The bell would never ring on command. The rope could be pulled, but the clapper would not strike. It only ever chimed on its own, a single clear note on nights when the rain fell hard and a soul from the mountains was beginning its long journey home. Title: The Gas Station Tapes. The 24-hour gas station on Route 58 in Virginia was a lonely outpost, a fluorescent beacon in a vast sea of darkness. For Michael, the station's manager, the overnight hours were a time of quiet routine and immense boredom. His main job, aside from selling coffee and cigarettes to the occasional trucker, was to review the previous night's security tapes. It was a mind-numbing task, watching hours of grainy, silent footage of an empty parking lot. In December of 2014, the tapes began to show something that was far from boring. It started subtly. Michael noticed gaps in the recordings. The timestamp in the corner of the screen would jump, skipping minutes, sometimes hours. He chalked it up to the aging DVR system, a relic that was constantly on the fritz. He reported it to the owner, who promised to get it looked at eventually. But then the nature of the footage began to change. It was no longer just skipping time. It was showing events that couldn't have happened. The first time, he saw a car pull up to Pump 3. It was an ordinary sedan, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. The car stopped. The driver's door opened, and then the frame froze. For exactly 30 seconds, the image was perfectly still, a static photograph of the car with its door ajar. When the footage resumed, the car was gone. The lot was empty. The pump was idle. Michael rewound the tape, watching it again. The car pulled in. The frame froze. The car was gone. There was no footage of it leaving, no sign of the driver, no record of a fuel purchase. It was as if the vehicle had been erased from existence during the 30-second pause. He checked the sales records for that time. Nothing. Pump 3 hadn't been activated all night. It was a glitch, he told himself. A really weird, specific glitch, but it happened again the next night. This time it was a pickup truck at Pump 5. It pulled in, the video froze for 30 seconds, and when it came back, the truck had vanished. The night after that, it was 2 cars at once, both disappearing from the frame during the same frozen interval. Michael began to watch the tapes with a mixture of dread and fascination. He was documenting an impossible phenomenon. The vehicles were always different, a random assortment of cars and trucks. They would arrive, pause for their 30 seconds of non-existence, and then be gone. He started logging the incidents, the make and model of each phantom vehicle. A pattern emerged. They always arrived between 3 and 4:09 a.m., the deadest hour of the night. Over the course of a week, he documented over a dozen such disappearances. He showed the tapes to his overnight clerk, a young woman named Sarah. She watched, her eyes wide, and confirmed that she had been on duty during those times and had seen none of those vehicles. The lot had been completely empty. The tapes were recording a phantom traffic jam that only the camera could see. The phenomenon escalated. One night, the tape showed a large tractor trailer pulling into the lot. It maneuvered its way to the diesel pumps, its running lights a brilliant display in the darkness. The frame froze. When it resumed, the truck was gone. But something was different. Michael could see faint, dark lines on the asphalt where the massive truck had been parked, the kind of oily residue and tire marks a heavy rig leaves behind. He went outside, flashlight in hand. The marks were there, faint but undeniable. Physical evidence of a truck that, according to his clerk and his sales records, had never existed. The DVR system wasn't just glitching. It was recording a reality that was somehow bleeding through into his own. Michael felt like he was losing his mind. He was the sole witness to a nightly parade of ghosts. He tried to capture the events in real time, staying up to watch the live feed on the monitor in his office. But whenever he watched live, nothing happened. The lot remained empty. The phantom vehicles only appeared for the detached, electronic eye of the recorder. It was as if the act of observation, of a human watching, kept them at bay. The final tape was the one that made him quit. He came in one morning, tired and on edge, and began the ritual of reviewing the footage. The usual phantom cars appeared and vanished. But then, around 3:30 a.m., something different happened. A single car, an old beat-up station wagon, pulled up to the front door of the convenience store. The frame froze for its customary 30 seconds, but when the footage resumed, the car was still there. The driver's door opened, and a figure got out. The image was too grainy to make out any features. It was just a dark, human-shaped silhouette. The figure walked to the glass door of the store and stood there, motionless, for a full minute, seeming to stare directly at the camera. Then, it turned, got back in its car, and drove away. The clerk, Sarah, had been inside the entire time, just a few feet from the door. She had seen nothing, heard nothing. Michael stared at the shadowy figure on the screen. The ghosts were no longer just passing through. They were stopping. They were looking. He felt a profound, terrifying sense of being noticed by something from a world that was not his own. He erased the tapes, all of them. He told the owner the DVR system had finally died for good. He gave his 2 weeks' notice the same day, citing family reasons. He never told anyone the full story. The convenience store's surveillance archive has a gap for December of 2014, officially attributed to equipment failure. It's a clean, simple explanation for a problem that was anything but. Michael now works a day job in an office with big windows and lots of sunlight. He avoids lonely roads and late-night drives. He knows that reality is thinner than we think, and that in the quiet hours, when the world is asleep, other versions of the road exist. And sometimes, the traffic from that other place pulls over, just for a moment, to refuel at a station that is only visible on a looping, silent, and deeply haunted security tape. Title: The Textile Mill Basement. The old Dan River textile mill in North Carolina was a cathedral of industry, abandoned to time and decay. Its vast, echoing halls were filled with silent looms and the ghosts of 1,000,000 hours of labor. When a development company bought the property in 2007, they sent in a renovation contractor named David Chen and his crew to assess the building's structural integrity. David was a practical man, a master of blueprints and load-bearing walls. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in dry rot and asbestos. The job was straightforward until they reached the basement. The basement was a labyrinth of steam pipes and dye vats, a place that hadn't seen sunlight in half a century. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, rust, and a faint chemical tang that clung to the back of the throat. In one of the larger rooms, they found a row of ancient-looking sewing machines, heavy, cast-iron beasts from the early 20th century. They were covered in a thick shroud of dust and cobwebs, relics of a forgotten process. That's when one of David's crew, a young man named Marco, called out. He had brushed the dust off one of the machines and found that it was still plugged into a crumbling wall socket. And he could feel a faint vibration. David came over, skeptical. He placed his hand on the machine's cold, iron body. Marco was right. There was a low, steady hum coming from within it, a subtle thrum of energy that had no business being there. They checked the other machines. They were all the same, plugged in and humming with a faint, impossible life. David's first thought was a short circuit, some kind of phantom power loop in the building's decaying electrical system. He went to the main breaker room. The breakers for the basement had been thrown 30 years ago. The massive knife switches were locked in the off position, covered in grime. He checked the utility meters outside. They were disconnected, their glass faces shattered. There was no power coming into the mill at all. Yet, in the dark, damp basement, a dozen antique sewing machines were humming, vibrating with a life they shouldn't possess. Back in the basement, the crew was growing visibly unnerved. The persistent, low hum was getting under their skin. Then they noticed the flywheels. The large, heavy wheels on the side of each machine, designed to be driven by a leather belt from a central motor, were turning. Not fast, but with a slow, inexorable creep, as if being pushed by an invisible hand. They moved without a sound, their slow rotation hypnotic and deeply wrong. David tried to stop one with his hand. It pushed back with a surprising, steady force. It was like trying to stop the gears of a clock. The source of the energy was not electrical. It was something else, something inherent to the machines themselves. The atmosphere in the basement grew heavier, more oppressive. The constant drip of water from the pipes overhead began to sound like whispers, the echoes forming half-heard words in the dark corners of the room. The men started hearing things, the faint whir of a spindle, the clack of a shuttle, the sound of fabric being pulled taut. They were the ghost sounds of a functioning factory, an auditory memory imprinted on the very air of the room. David, clinging to his rational worldview, tried to find a scientific explanation. He theorized that a combination of moisture, mineral deposits, and the building's massive iron infrastructure was creating a giant, rudimentary battery, a galvanic cell generating a tiny current. It was a wild theory, but it was better than the alternative. He used a voltmeter on one of the machines. The needle didn't move. There was no detectable voltage. His theory collapsed, leaving only the impossible reality. The crew had had enough. Two of the men refused to go back into the basement, talking in hushed tones about a bad feeling, about the sense of being watched by the silent machines. David knew he was losing them. He had to finish the assessment. He went back down, alone this time, armed with a powerful flashlight and a determination to solve the puzzle. As he stood in the center of the room, the humming of the machine seemed to grow louder, more insistent. The flywheels turned, their pace quickening ever so slightly. He shone as they shone, light on the walls, and saw the dark, wet stains of years of water damage. But in the shifting beam of his flashlight, the stains seemed to coalesce, to form shapes. They looked like human silhouettes, hunched over, their forms matching the positions of the workers who would have operated these very machines. They were shadows burned into the wall, memories made of mildew and damp. A sudden, sharp clang echoed through the room. One of the machine's presser feet had slammed down, as if a ghostly operator had just finished a seam. David spun around, his heart pounding. The machines were becoming more active, responding to his presence. He felt a cold draft sweep through the room, though there were no windows, no vents. It carried with it the smell of sweat and machine oil. He could almost feel the presence of the women who had worked here, their lives spent in this dark, damp room, their energy, their very essence, absorbed by the iron and steel they had commanded for decades. He backed away slowly, his flashlight beam trembling. The humming rose in pitch, the flywheel spinning faster now, a chorus of impossible motion in the dark. He had seen enough. This wasn't a job for a contractor. It was a job for an exorcist. David and his crew packed up their tools and walked off the job that afternoon. He filed a report with the development company, citing unsafe structural conditions and hazardous materials in the basement. A vague but effective way to condemn the space without sounding insane. The OSHA inspection report that followed confirmed the structural risks, allowing the developers to seal the basement permanently, filling it with concrete. The official story is that the space was too dangerous to reclaim. The truth is that they were terrified of what was down there. David Chen never took a job in an old building again. He can't forget the low hum of those machines, the slow, relentless turning of the flywheels. He understood that some places absorb the lives that are lived within them, that the energy of human labor, of decades of repetition and toil, can leave an imprint so strong that it can make dead machines move. The textile mill was converted into luxury lofts, its upper floors now bright and modern, but the basement is still there, a solid block of concrete in the earth. And sometimes the residents on the first floor complain of a faint, vibrating hum coming up through the floorboards, a sound like a distant sleeping factory, still dreaming of the work it used to do. Title: The Overlook Roadhouse. The Overlook Roadhouse in the mountains of Kentucky was a place out of time, a roadside diner that had been serving coffee and pie since the highways were just two-lane blacktops. For Maggie, a waitress working her way through community college in the fall of 1993, it was a good job. The regulars were friendly, the work was steady, and the view from the big plate glass windows was spectacular, especially when the evening fog rolled into the valley below. The fog was a character in itself, a living entity that could swallow the world in minutes, reducing visibility to a few feet and muffling all sound. It was on one such foggy night in November that the strange cars began to appear. The diner was quiet, just a few truckers nursing their coffee and a couple on a late dinner. The fog outside was a solid, impenetrable wall of white. Then, through the thick soup, Maggie saw them. A pair of headlights, then another, and another. They were faint at first, just soft, diffused glows. But they were growing brighter, closer. A trucker by the counter, a man named Earl, noticed them too. "Looks like you're about to get a rush," he grumbled, taking a sip of his coffee. Maggie watched, puzzled. She could see the headlights clearly now, at least a half-dozen pairs, pulling into the diner's large gravel parking lot, but she couldn't hear them. There was no crunch of tires on gravel, no rumble of engines, no slamming of car doors. Just the same profound silence from the fog-drenched world outside. The headlights cut out, one by one, plunging the lot back into an eerie, uniform whiteness. She and the other patrons waited, expecting a crowd of new customers to come through the door. The bell over the door remained silent. A full minute passed. No one came in. "Well, where are they?" asked the woman from the couple, her voice tinged with unease. Earl got up from his stool and walked to the door, peering out into the thick fog. He opened it, letting in a swirl of cold, damp air. "There's nobody out here," he called back, his voice sounding small and lost in the mist. "No cars neither." Maggie and the others crowded around the door. The parking lot was completely, utterly empty. There were no cars, no people, no sign that anyone had been there at all. They stood in stunned silence, the impossible event hanging in the air between them. They had all seen it. A half-dozen cars had pulled into the lot and then simply ceased to exist. They tried to explain it away. A reflection. A trick of the fog. Maybe the headlights they saw were from the main highway, their lights scattering in the mist to create the illusion of cars in the lot. It was a flimsy explanation, but it was all they had. They went back to their seats, the warm, cheerful atmosphere of the diner replaced with a tense, nervous quiet. The incident was unsettling, a shared hallucination that no one wanted to talk about. An hour later, as Maggie was clearing a table, she glanced out the window again. The fog had thinned slightly. In the pale glow of the diner's neon sign, she could see the surface of the parking lot. And on the dark, damp gravel, she saw tire tracks. Dozens of them. They were fresh, clear imprints in the wet earth. But the tracks were wrong. They led from the highway into the parking spaces, and then they just stopped. There were no corresponding tracks leading back out. It was as if the cars had driven into the lot and then been lifted straight up into the sky. She called Earl over to the window. He saw them too, his face paling. This was no trick of the light. This was physical evidence of an impossible event. He went outside to get a closer look. When he came back in, his expression was grim. "They're not just tire tracks," he said, his voice low. "The gravel, it's pressed down, like something real heavy was sitting there. But there's no oil drips, no scuff marks, nothing." The night ended without further incident. The fog eventually lifted, revealing a clear, star-filled sky. But the mystery of the phantom cars remained. The local sheriff's deputy stopped by the next morning for his coffee. Maggie and Earl told him the story. The deputy, a young man who had grown up in the area, listened patiently, then went outside to look at the tracks. He came back in, shrugging. He filed a brief field note, a one-line entry about unusual atmospheric conditions causing visual disturbances. He said headlights scatter in dense fog was a known phenomenon, and the tracks were probably from earlier in the day and had just been revealed as the rain-soaked gravel dried out. It was a neat, tidy explanation that dismissed the shared experience of half a dozen eyewitnesses. But the people who were in the Overlook Roadhouse that night knew what they had seen. They had been witnesses to a silent arrival, a fleet of phantom vehicles materializing out of the fog and vanishing into thin air, leaving behind only the ghost of their weight on the earth. The diner is gone now, torn down to make way for a new, wider highway. But the story lingers in the mountains. Some of the old-timers say that stretch of road has always been strange, a place where the fog gets thick and time seems to thin. They say that sometimes another road, one that isn't on any map, briefly intersects with our own. And if you're in the right place at the right time, you can see the traffic from that other place, the silent travelers on a journey through the mist, just passing through on their way to a destination that lies somewhere on the other side of the fog. Title: The Furnace Room. The Harrison County Courthouse was a grand old building, a testament to a time of civic pride and solid stone construction. For Arthur Penn, the building's head janitor in the winter of 2000, it was a place of predictable routines and comforting silence after the lawyers and judges had gone home for the day. His nights were spent in a solitary dance of mopping, waxing, and dusting, the only sounds the echo of his own footsteps in the cavernous hallways. The courthouse had a secret heart, a place few people ever saw: the furnace room. It was a subterranean labyrinth of boilers, pipes, and ducts, a greasy, dust-choked space that housed the building's ancient heating system. The furnaces themselves were colossal iron beasts, installed in the 1930s, their fires long since extinguished in favor of a modern boiler system. They were just cold, silent monuments now, relics of a coal-powered past. The strange occurrences began in February, a month of deep, biting cold. Arthur started hearing noises coming from the basement. It was a loud, rhythmic banging, a sound like metal on metal that seemed to emanate from directly beneath the main courtroom. At first, he dismissed it as the building settling or the old pipes contracting in the cold. Old buildings made noises. It was a fact of life. But the banging became a regular feature of his nights. It would start around midnight and continue for an hour, a steady, deliberate rhythm like a blacksmith at his forge. It was too regular, too forceful to be the random groans of an old structure. It sounded like someone was down there, hammering on the old furnaces. One night, driven by a mixture of annoyance and curiosity, Arthur descended the steep concrete steps into the furnace room to investigate. The air was cold and still. The massive furnaces were dark and silent, their iron doors shut tight. He walked the length of the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick, dusty air. There was no one there. He was completely alone. But as he shone his light on the floor in front of the largest furnace, the one they called Old Bessie, he saw something that made him freeze. Soot. A fresh, black layer of soot was scattered on the concrete floor around the furnace's sealed firebox door. It hadn't been there on his last inspection. It looked as if the door had been recently opened, a puff of old, stale soot escaping from the furnace's long-dead gut. He touched the furnace's iron shell. It was stone cold. This made no sense. He checked the thermostat logs in the main control room. The new boiler system was functioning perfectly, maintaining a steady temperature throughout the building. But as he scanned the data from the previous night, he found an anomaly. The sensors in the main courtroom, the room directly above the noisy furnace, had registered a sudden, inexplicable temperature spike of 20 degrees, lasting for exactly 1 hour, the same hour he had heard the banging. The building's modern, efficient heating system had been briefly overpowered by a phantom heat source from below. Arthur was a man who believed in facts and figures, in the tangible world of cleaning supplies and maintenance schedules. But the evidence was pointing to something deeply irrational. The cold furnace, the fresh soot, the phantom heat, the rhythmic banging, they were pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. He started researching the courthouse's history in the local archives. He learned that in the winter of 1938, a homeless man had been discovered seeking shelter from a blizzard in the furnace room. He had been found dead, having climbed inside the firebox of Old Bessie to escape the bitter cold, only to be burned alive when the furnace was unknowingly fired up the next morning. The story chilled Arthur to the bone. The banging he was hearing, the phantom heat he was seeing in the logs. It was all centered on the anniversary of that man's horrific death. The furnace was replaying a memory. It was trying to come back to life. The banging continued every night for a week. Arthur stopped going down to the basement. He would just listen from the floor above. The rhythmic, metallic clang, a grim reminder of the building's dark secret. He felt a profound pity for the spirit trapped in the iron heart of the courthouse, forever reliving its final, fiery moments. The last night it happened was the worst. The banging was louder, more frantic. The temperature spike in the courtroom above was nearly 40 degrees. The court clerk, who arrived the next morning, complained that her office, which was adjacent to the courtroom, smelled faintly of smoke and burned cloth. Arthur knew he had to do something. He couldn't go on working in a place so deeply haunted. That evening, he went down to the furnace room one last time. He stood before the massive cold furnace and spoke into the silence. He said he was sorry for what had happened, that the man's suffering was known, that he could be at peace now. It felt foolish, talking to a piece of old machinery, but he felt compelled to do it. The banging never happened again. The thermostat logs returned to normal. The strange smell of smoke faded. The courthouse settled back into its quiet, predictable rhythm. The county facilities maintenance file from February of 2000 has a work order submitted by Arthur Penn. It requests an inspection of the heating ducts for acoustic anomalies, a technical, impersonal phrase he used to describe the unexplainable. The report came back negative. No source for the noise was ever found. Arthur Penn retired a few years later. He never told anyone the full story of what he experienced in the courthouse basement. But he never forgot the feeling of that phantom heat, or the rhythmic, desperate sound of a ghost trying to escape a prison of cold iron. He understood that some buildings don't just have memories, they have scars. And sometimes, in the dead of winter, those old wounds can burn again. Title: The Hollow Hospital Wing. The James H. Quillen VA Medical Center, a sprawling complex tucked into the mountains of East Tennessee, is a place of healing and memory. Its modern wings are filled with the latest technology, but parts of the older campus have been dormant for decades. In January of 2019, a night security guard named Thomas was making his rounds when he saw something that defied every rule of his rational world. His patrol included monitoring the feeds from the hospital's extensive network of security cameras. One section of his monitor bank was dedicated to the old Building 23, a former long-term care wing that had been sealed and abandoned since the 1960s. The cameras there were new, part of a recent system upgrade, and they were infrared, designed to detect motion and heat signatures in the dark, empty corridors. The wing was supposed to be a dead zone, a series of black and gray images showing nothing but cold, still rooms. On this particular night, it wasn't. Thomas was doing a routine scan of the monitors when he froze, leaning closer to the screen. On the feed from the third-floor ward, he could see figures. They were faint, milky white shapes on the dark infrared display, the unmistakable heat signatures of human bodies. They were lying in the beds that should have been empty, stripped of their mattresses 50 years ago. He could count at least a dozen of them. each one a pale, ghostly form under a non-existent blanket. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, sure it was a trick of the light, a technical glitch. He toggled the camera's settings, switching from infrared to the standard low-light view. The screen showed an empty, derelict ward, filled with dust and decay. The beds were bare metal frames. The room was empty. He switched back to infrared. The figures were still there, lying peacefully. As he watched, his heart pounding, one of the figures moved. It turned slowly on its side, a simple, human movement that was utterly impossible. Thomas felt a cold dread spread through him. He was watching a ghost ward, a room full of patients that only the heat-sensitive eye of the camera could see. He immediately called his supervisor, a man named Henderson. Henderson was a pragmatist, a man who had seen his share of false alarms. He came down to the security office, listened to Thomas's frantic explanation, and looked at the screen. He saw them too. He had no explanation. Protocol dictated they investigate. They were supposed to go into the wing to put eyes on the situation. But the wing was sealed. The doors were chained and padlocked. Getting inside would require bolt cutters and a formal request to facilities management. Henderson, looking at the pale, moving figures on the screen, made a decision. They would not go in. They would log the event as an infrared sensor malfunction and call the technicians in the morning. It was a clean, bureaucratic solution to a problem that felt anything but clean. For the rest of the night, Thomas couldn't take his eyes off the monitor. He watched the silent, spectral patients in their beds. He saw another one sit up, its form indistinct, and look around the dark room before lying back down. He felt a profound sense of trespassing, of looking in on a private, secret world that was not meant for his eyes. The figures weren't frightening in their actions. They were just there, resting, existing in a thermal echo of a time long past. What was terrifying was the sheer impossibility of it. The next morning, the technicians arrived. They ran diagnostics on the camera, checked the wiring, and found nothing wrong. The equipment was functioning perfectly. When they looked at the live feed, the ward was empty. The figures were gone. The infrared view showed nothing but a cold, dead room, the temperature uniform throughout. They recorded the incident as a transient environmental anomaly, suggesting that perhaps a flock of birds roosting on the roof or a pocket of warm air from the building's ventilation system had created the false readings. It was a plausible theory, but it didn't explain the distinctly human shapes or the way they had moved. Thomas knew what he had seen. The event was logged and forgotten by the hospital administration, but not by him. He became obsessed with Building 23. He started digging into the hospital's archives, looking for information about the old ward. He found that it had been a palliative care unit, a place where soldiers from the wars in Korea and Vietnam had come to live out their final days. It was a place of profound suffering and quiet dignity. The wing wasn't just abandoned, it was saturated with memory. A few weeks later, Thomas was on the night shift again, his eyes glued to the monitor for Building 23. The ward remained empty, a silent space of gray and black. But then, just after 3 a.m., a single figure appeared. It wasn't in a bed this time. It was standing in the center of the room, a faint, human-shaped column of warmth. It stood motionless for a long time, as if on watch. Then it slowly raised an arm and seemed to wave, not at the camera, but at the empty beds around it. Then it faded, disappearing back into the cold. Thomas didn't report this sighting. He knew it would do no good. He was the sole guardian of this secret. the lonely night watchman for a ward of ghosts. He understood that the infrared cameras weren't malfunctioning. They were working too well. They were picking up a different kind of energy, the residual heat of life, the echoes of souls who had never left their final post. The VA security tape from that night in January 2019 was eventually taped over, its impossible images erased. The official explanation of a sensor glitch stands, but Thomas still works the night shift, and every time he scans the monitors for Building 23, he looks for his silent, spectral patients. He sees them as a testament to the fact that some people never truly leave the places that defined them. They remain, a faint warmth in the cold, a silent presence waiting for a guard to make his rounds, ensuring that they are not and never will be forgotten. Title: The River Crossing. The Silver Bridge at Point Pleasant had cast a long, dark shadow over the Ohio River Valley ever since its collapse in 1967. The tragedy was woven into the fabric of the community, a story of twisted steel and lost lives. The new bridge that replaced it, the Silver Memorial Bridge, was a modern marvel of engineering, a symbol of recovery and safety. For State Trooper Ben Morgan, patrolling its span in the pre-dawn hours of May 1988 was usually a quiet, meditative affair. The bridge was scheduled for a routine structural inspection, which meant it was closed to all traffic from midnight until 6 a.m. Ben's job was to sit in his cruiser at the West Virginia entrance, ensuring no one tried to cross. The night was still and foggy, the bridge's massive superstructure disappearing into a low-hanging mist over the dark, sluggish river. Around 2:30 a.m., Ben heard it. It started as a low rumble, a vibration he felt through the seat of his car more than he heard with his ears. The sound grew steadily, resolving into the unmistakable noise of heavy trucks, a full convoy of them, their diesel engines laboring, their tires humming on the pavement. He sat up, instantly alert, grabbing his radio. Someone had broken through the barriers on the Ohio side. He could hear the trucks clearly now. They were on the bridge, moving across the deck high above the river, their sounds echoing in the dense fog. He could hear the clatter of their trailers, the hiss of their air brakes. It sounded like at least a dozen heavy rigs. He radioed dispatch, reporting a breach of the closure, his voice sharp and urgent. He reported a convoy of trucks crossing eastbound, heading directly for his position. Dispatch confirmed that the Ohio side trooper had reported no such breach. His barriers were secure. The bridge was empty. Ben stared into the fog, his rational mind at war with the evidence of his own ears. The sound was immense, overwhelming. The entire bridge seemed to be vibrating with the passage of an immense weight. He could feel it in his bones. He expected to see the headlights of the lead truck burst through the fog at any second. But they never came. The sound of the convoy reached a crescendo as if it were passing directly over him. And then it began to fade, the engine noises receding as the phantom trucks continued their journey into West Virginia. Within a minute, the bridge was silent again, the only sound the gentle lapping of the river below. Ben sat in his cruiser, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind reeling. He had heard it. It wasn't a trick of the wind. It was a real, physical event. He got out of his car and walked onto the bridge approach, his flashlight cutting a nervous beam into the mist. He could smell it, the faint, acrid scent of diesel exhaust hanging in the damp air. The engineering crew was scheduled to arrive at dawn. Ben waited for them. A deep sense of unease settled over him. When the lead engineer, a man named Patterson, arrived, Ben told him the story. Patterson was skeptical but professional. He said that the bridge was equipped with a series of highly sensitive strain gauges embedded in the structure to measure stress and weight distribution in real time. If a convoy of trucks had crossed the bridge, the gauges would have recorded it. They went to the small monitoring station at the base of the bridge. The gauges fed their data to a computer that printed out a continuous log. Patterson pulled the roll of paper from the previous night. He scanned the neat lines of data, and then he stopped, his skepticism vanishing, replaced by a look of profound confusion. At 2:32 a.m., Shabaikin gauges had registered a massive rolling load moving across the bridge from west to east. The data was consistent with the weight of approximately 12 to 15 fully loaded tractor trailers. The sensors had confirmed it. The bridge had carried a weight that was not there. Patterson had no explanation. He called it anomalous data, a phrase that meant nothing. As the sun rose, burning away the fog, the full expanse of the bridge was revealed. It was completely empty, stretching across the placid river. But as the morning light hit the asphalt deck at a low angle, Ben saw something else. Indentations, faint but visible. The distinct parallel lines of tire wear, marks of heavy use on a surface that had been closed to traffic for hours. It was as if a ghost fleet had passed, leaving behind not just the memory of its sound and the data of its weight, but a physical trace of its passage. The DOT sensor log from that night in May 1988 is an official public record. It clearly shows the massive, unexplained weight spike. The official explanation attached to the file suggests the sensors misinterpreted vibrations from a sudden surge in the river's current, or perhaps minor seismic activity. It's a convenient, scientific explanation that ignores the testimony of the trooper who heard the engines and smelled the diesel. Ben Morgan served another 20 years on the force, but he never forgot that night. He had been a witness to a procession, a spectral replay of the commerce that had plied the river and its crossings for generations. The locals have their own theories. Some say it's an echo of the past, the ghost of a military convoy from the Second World War. Others have a darker explanation. They say it's a reenactment of the traffic that was on the original Silver Bridge, the night it fell into the icy water. They believe that on certain foggy nights, the trucks and cars that never made it to the other side try to complete their journey, their phantom weight a grim reminder of a promise unfulfilled. Ben doesn't know what to believe, but he knows that some bridges don't just connect two pieces of land. They connect two different times, and sometimes, in the dead of night, you can still feel the weight of the traffic from a long, long time ago. Title: The Hollow Barn. Jedediah's farm was tucked away in a quiet Tennessee hollow, a place where the rhythms of life were dictated by the sun and the seasons. His family had worked this land for generations, and he knew its every rock and creek. The heart of the farm was the main barn, a massive century-old structure of graying timber that smelled of hay, earth, and livestock. In the winter of 1991, the barn, a place of sanctuary and familiarity, became a source of deep, unnerving fear. It began with the cattle. It was a bitterly cold December, and the herd should have been eager to get into the warmth of the barn for their evening feed. But they refused. They would stand at the massive open doorway, lowing uneasily, their breath pluming in the frigid air. But they would not cross the threshold. No amount of coaxing could get them inside. They preferred to huddle together in the frozen pasture, their fear of the barn greater than their fear of the cold. Jedediah was a practical man. His first thought was predators. A coyote or a wildcat must have gotten into the barn, its scent keeping the cattle at bay. He grabbed his rifle and a powerful lantern and went to investigate. The barn was silent, the air still and cold. He walked the length of the central aisle, his light cutting through the gloom, illuminating the empty stalls and the massive stacks of hay in the loft. There was no sign of any animal, no tracks, no droppings, no scent of a predator, but the barn felt wrong. The air was heavy, charged with a strange static energy. The lanterns he had hung from the rafters, simple oil lamps, were glowing with a dim, weak light, even though he knew he had extinguished them that morning and their oil reservoirs were empty. He felt a prickling on the back of his neck, the primal, unmistakable feeling of being watched. He dismissed it as nerves and the strange behavior of his herd. He scattered fresh hay, checked the water troughs, and left, securing the big doors behind him. The next day, the cattle still refused to enter. That's when he noticed the hay. The neat bales he had stored in the loft were broken apart, the hay scattered across the floor below. But it wasn't just scattered randomly. It was arranged in strange, swirling spirals, intricate patterns that no animal or gust of wind could have created. They were deliberate, geometric, and covered the entire barn floor. A cold knot of fear tightened in Jedediah's stomach. This was not the work of an animal. This was something else. Desperate for a rational answer, he bought a set of battery-powered motion detectors, the kind used for home security. He placed them at the main door, the hayloft, and the back entrance. That night, he sat in his farmhouse kitchen, the receiver for the motion detectors in front of him, watching the small red lights that corresponded to each sensor. For hours, they remained dark. The barn was still. Then, around 2 a.m., the light for the main door flashed. An alarm chirped. Something had just entered the barn. A minute later, the sensor in the hayloft tripped. Then the one at the back door. They began to flash in a rapid, chaotic sequence, indicating movement all over the barn at once. It was as if a dozen invisible people were running through the building. Jedediah grabbed his shotgun, his heart pounding. He ran to the barn, the snow crunching under his boots. He threw open the doors, expecting to confront a group of trespassing kids or vandals. The barn was empty. The air was silent and cold. The hay on the floor had been rearranged into new, even more complex spirals. And the motion detectors were going wild, their lights flashing erratically, sensing a frantic activity that he could not see. He backed out of the barn slowly, a profound terror taking hold of him. He was dealing with something that was real enough to move hay and trip sensors, but was completely invisible to the human eye. He spoke to his neighbor, an old man named Silas, who knew all the local history and folklore. Silas listened to Jedediah's story, his weathered face grim. He told him that the hollow where the farm sat had a history. The land had been the site of a forgotten tragedy a century earlier. A conflict between settlers and the native tribes that had ended in bloodshed, right on the spot where the barn now stood. Silas said some places hold on to that kind of pain, that the energy of a violent event can linger, replaying itself over and over. "That barn ain't empty, Jed," Silas said, his voice low. "It's just crowded with folks you can't see." Jedediah stopped trying to use the barn. He fed his cattle in the open fields, their fear now making perfect sense. He would still see the motion detector receiver flash wildly every night, a silent, frantic light show from the haunted structure. The County Agricultural Extension Office has a note in its file from December 1991. It documents Jedediah's report of his cattle refusing to be sheltered. The official suggestion from the agent was to check for stray voltage from faulty wiring. or to look for signs of rodent infestation, both of which are known to make livestock uneasy. The note makes no mention of impossible spirals of hay or the testimony of a motion detector sensing an invisible crowd. The barn still stands, but Jedediah never uses it. He built a new, smaller shelter for his animals on the other side of the property. The old barn is left to its silent, unseen occupants. He says that sometimes, on a cold, clear winter night, if you stand near it, you can hear things. Not voices, but the faint sounds of movement, the rustle of hay, and a deep, profound sense of sorrow that seems to soak into the very timbers of the old building. It is a place of memory, a shelter not for the living, but for the restless echoes of a long-forgotten battle. Title: The Appalachian Rest Stop. The rest stops that dot the highways of West Virginia are lonely places, especially after midnight. They are oases of concrete and dim lighting, islands of brief respite in the vast, dark wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. For Curtis, a cleaner contracted by the Department of Transportation in March of 2006, they were his nightly office. His job was to clean the facilities, empty the trash, and restock the vending machines. It was a solitary, thankless job, but it was steady. The strangeness began at the new River Gorge rest area, a particularly isolated stop with a reputation for being a little off. Curtis arrived one night to find the snack machine completely empty. Every single coil was bare. This was odd, as he had just stocked it full the night before. His first thought was that the machine had been broken into, but the heavy lock on the front was intact, unscratched. He unlocked it with his key. The cash box inside was empty too, but there was no sign of forced entry. It was as if someone with a key had emptied it. He was the only one with a key. He checked the machine's internal counter. It showed that dozens of transactions had taken place overnight. This was impossible. The rest stop was nearly deserted at night. The machine was lucky to get a handful of sales. Shaken, he moved on to the soda machine. It was the same story. Fully stocked the night before, now completely empty. The lock was secure. The cash box was empty. The counter showed a high volume of sales. He felt a cold unease. Who was buying all these snacks and drinks in the middle of the night at a deserted rest stop? And how were they doing it without breaking into the machines? He decided to check the security camera footage. The DOT had recently installed a single camera overlooking the vending area. The footage was grainy and time-lapsed, taking a single photo every minute. Curtis spooled through the images from the previous night. The pictures showed the empty rest area, the vending machines glowing under the fluorescent lights. The hours ticked by. No one approached the machines. No cars entered the lot. No people appeared in the frame. Yet, as he watched the time-stamped images, he could see the products in the machines disappearing. 1 minute, a row of potato chips was full. The next minute, a single bag was gone. A few minutes later, another. The sodas vanished one by one. The process continued all night, an invisible force emptying the machines, item by item. The footage was terrifying in its mundane impossibility. There was no glitch, no trick of the light. Just a clean, clear record of products vanishing into thin air. He checked the power logs for the rest stop. The machines had been drawing electricity all night, consistent with their coolers running and their lights being on. But then, he found something else. He found the maintenance logs for the payphones. 2 old-fashioned booths that stood at the edge of the parking lot. The phone company had recently installed diagnostic recorders on the lines to track technical faults. The logs from the previous night showed that the phones had been active. The receivers had been lifted off their hooks dozens of times, and the recorders had picked up the sound of a dial tone. But no numbers were ever dialed. The phones were just being picked up, held for a few moments, and then hung up again. The invisible visitors weren't just hungry. They were trying to make a call. Curtis started leaving a single row of snacks in the machine each night. He would come back the next morning to find it empty. He was stocking a ghost pantry for a clientele that he could never see. He began to feel like he was not alone during his shifts. He would hear the faint sound of a coin dropping on the concrete, only to find nothing there. The ductor to the restroom would swing shut as if pushed by a draft, even on a perfectly still night. The place was a hub of unseen activity, a way station for travelers on a different kind of highway. The DOT maintenance sheet from March 2006 contains Curtis's reports of the vending machine malfunctions. The official assessment by a technician concluded that faulty coin mechanisms and a possible power surge were causing ghost transactions, leading to the machines dispensing products without payment. The empty cash boxes were attributed to a separate act of theft by a skilled lockpicker. It's a neat, plausible explanation that completely ignores the security footage and the payphone logs. Curtis quit the job after a month. He couldn't handle the constant, low-grade terror of servicing a rest stop for the dead. He knew that the place was more than just a place to rest. It was a nexus, a point of connection between worlds. He imagines them, the silent, invisible travelers of the Appalachian night. They pull off their unseen highway, weary from their journey. They buy a snack, a soda, try to make a call home to a place that can no longer be reached. They are the ghosts of the road, the countless souls who have traveled these mountains over the centuries. And for them, the New River Gorge rest stop is still open, its lights a welcoming beacon in a darkness that only they can see. Title: The Hollow Depot. The old train depot in Abingdon, Virginia, was a place of echoes. Though the last passenger train had pulled out in the 1950s, and the tracks themselves had been torn up for a recreational trail, the building itself remained, a proud brick ghost dreaming of a busier time. For Arthur Bailey, the depot's last station master, it held a lifetime of memories. Now, in his 80s, he would often walk the few blocks from his home to visit the shuttered building, a quiet pilgrimage to his own past. In the early summer of 1975, long after the depot had closed, Arthur began to hear it again. The whistle. It was the distinct, mournful cry of a steam locomotive, the 4:45 a.m. southbound creeper, a train he had managed for 20 years. The sound was faint but unmistakable, echoing through the pre-dawn stillness of the town. At first, he thought he was dreaming, his old mind playing tricks on him. But it happened every morning, at precisely 4:45 a.m. The whistle would blow, a long, lonely call, and then silence. He started talking to his neighbors, other old-timers who lived near the defunct rail line. They had heard it too. More than that, they had felt it. A low, deep vibration in the ground, a rumble that shook the china in their cabinets, just as the real train had done decades ago. It was as if the train was still running, its passage felt but not seen. The tracks were gone. The depot was empty. The train was a ghost. Arthur, a man of methodical habits, began a quiet investigation. He would sit on the depot's silent platform in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting. Every morning at 4:45, the whistle would sound, seeming to come from a few miles up the hollow where the tracks used to be. And every morning, he would feel the familiar tremor in the wooden planks beneath his feet, the phantom weight of a multi-ton locomotive and its carriages rolling past on rails of memory. He went to the local historical society and pulled the old USGS seismograph bulletins for the region. He was looking for any recorded seismic activity that could explain the vibrations. The records showed nothing. No earthquakes, no tremors from the nearby coal mines. But as he looked closer at the delicate, spidery lines of the seismograph readings, he saw it. A faint, rhythmic anomaly. A recurring disturbance too small to be classified as a geological event, but present nonetheless. It appeared every morning at exactly 4:45 a.m. and lasted for approximately 3 minutes, the exact amount of time it would have taken for the old creeper to pass through town. The ground itself was remembering the train. Arthur felt a sense of profound awe. The train hadn't just been a machine running on tracks. It had been a part of the landscape, its daily passage a rhythmic heartbeat that had become ingrained in the very rock and earth of the hollow. The weight, the sound, the energy of its journey had left a permanent scar, an echo that was still replaying itself 20 years after the last run. The depot itself seemed to be a focal point for this energy. Arthur, using his old keys, let himself inside the dusty, silent building. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and cold soot. He ran his hand along the oak ticket counter, worn smooth by 100,000 hands. He could almost hear the ghosts of conversation, the calls for departure, the hurried goodbyes. He began to notice small things. A faint layer of coal dust would appear on the windowsills, even though the building was sealed. The old telegraph key in the station master's office would sometimes be found in a different position than he had left it. The massive station clock, its hands frozen at the time of the last train's departure, would sometimes have condensation on its glass face, as if a warm, steamy presence had just passed by. The town of Abingdon embraced the story of the phantom train. It became a piece of local folklore, a charming ghost story. But for Arthur, it was something more. It was a validation of his life's work. It was proof that the things we build, the routines we keep, the energy we expend, can leave an impression on the world that outlasts us. The USGS seismograph bulletin from June of 1975 is a dry, scientific document. It contains no mention of ghost trains. The rhythmic anomalies Arthur found are footnotes, dismissed as low-frequency interference from atmospheric conditions or distant industrial activity. But anyone who lived in that hollow in 1975 and for years after knows the truth. They know that every morning, a train that no longer exists still makes its run. It barrels through the mountains on tracks of memory, its whistle a lonely cry for a world that has disappeared. Arthur Bailey passed away a few years later, but they say his presence can still be felt in the old depot, a silent station master waiting for a train that is always on time, forever bound for a destination that is no longer on any map.